Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. This month we're going to be looking at the departure of Robin Swan as Ulster Unionist leader, the recent Supreme Court decision on the prorogation of Parliament and the changing positions of the three main parties in the UK over Brexit. And to go through these important issues we have Brendan Mulgrew from MWA Advocate, we have Creighton, Commentator and Brendan Hughes from the Irish News. So Brendan, I'll start with you. Obviously we've had the announcement that Robin Swan will be stepping down as Ulster Unionist leader. There'll be now a 5-month leadership contest. He remains in post until February. What did you make of his announcement today?
Well, I suppose I wasn't taken by surprise, given that Robin seemed fairly neutral on whether or not he was going to stay on as leader after this year's local government elections. He more or less said, it's up to the party. If they want me to go, I'll go. If no one does anything about it, I'll stay. It wasn't exactly, a colours to the mast, I'm staying here for the long term and I'm going to give it everything I've got. It's clearly a very pressured role as well, and Robin's a man with a young family. He alludes to that in his statement. So I'm not surprised by it. I don't think, unfortunately, from the UUP point of view, it's not an earth-shattering announcement. It's not as it would have been perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. It's not. Everyone's not going to sit up and take notice and debate this for months and months to see who's going to be the new leader. Unfortunately, from their point of view, it's sort of a shrug the shoulders. Who comes next? Will it really make a difference?
Yeah. Okay. But Sarah, what do you think of his?
It was kind of suspected. The biggest thing that hits me is that he's resigning now. There's possibly going to be an election coming up in the next few months. If it's before Christmas, he's going to be still a figurehead at trying to drive the party through that election. If it's maybe done a bit quicker than usual, just before the election, it's going to be somebody brand new is going to have to step into that and go forward. The Ulster Unionist Party didn't have a great European election. They held in the local election, but they did have some losses, and the party really is at a very difficult place at the moment, in the sense that the DUP really are still dominating. That section of Ulster Unionism really doesn't really know what its place is, and at the moment it is very much seen as being DUP light. So the question is going to be, well, who's going to be able to come in here and try and shake things up a bit?
Totally. Brendan, what did you make of the announcement that came?
I think the only thing that was surprising about this was that the UUP had created a headline for once, because for the past 2 years since Robin Swan has been the leader, they've been pretty invisible, really. Granted, he did come out in at a time after the Snap Assembly election in 2017, where Mike Nesbitt was leader and the UUP wasn't able to make the gains that it expected to make whenever the DUP was under pressure over RHI. So I suppose very quickly after him being leader, he then had the loss of his MPs at Westminster in the Snap Westminster election there, and then he's had losses in the council elections this year and lost the only MEP for the UUP in the European election as well. So it's been a run of bad election results. So that's, it's been difficult for him to try and build a party on, a run of elections where you're up against it. But I don't think Robin Swan has helped himself. He hasn't really steered the party in a clear direction which distinguishes itself from the DUP. And a lot of the time, whenever I've been reporting on various different issues, it feels as though the UUP has simply been in the DUP's shadow in many issues. And so therefore, for Unionist voters, what are they getting from the UUP that is different from the DUP, particularly on Brexit? Whenever we've had various different discussions about the various machinations around Brexit, it's been difficult to know what the UUP actually stands for, and to the average person in the street, why would they vote for the UUP at this stage?
Okay, so you're not a fan, obviously, of Robin Swan's leadership. Brendan, what do you make of, just on that, so what do you make of Robin Swan's 2 now and a bit years? He'll be just under 3 years by the time he departs. Yeah. What do you make of his time?
It's a very short tenure, actually, in terms of party leadership, and so was Mike Nesbitt's time in the end. Was fairly short too. I think Brendan's hit on a very good point. There's a Unionist Remain vote out there, and there's certainly a Unionist anti-no deal Brexit vote, which the UUP should have been tapping into, should have capitalised on. Remain was a position they took into the referendum, and yet they so quickly moved away from that in a way which Alliance didn't and other parties didn't and the SDLP didn't, and they were able to coalesce around it, even if it's an anti-no deal Brexit or Remain position that they could have held and could have marked themselves out in that way. Clearly a very nice guy and all of that. Maybe that's a weakness in politics as opposed to a strength. He has not made a mark. It's hard to look back over those 2.5 years and say, well, he made this big decision, or he placed this candidate in this constituency to a resounding success. None of that has happened. So I'm afraid to say he's been a fairly anonymous leader in a fairly dull time for the UUP.
Okay, Sarah, what do you rate him?
Yeah, I think the point about Remain is key here. I mean, the Ulster Unionist Party are, well, along with the DP, very, very opposed to the backstop, and that position very much represents, I'd say, the majority of Unionists, but their party supported Remain. I think a lot of their voters voted Remain. So the question is going to be, where do they fit in all of this, basically? And if they can't capture that vote. They're not going to be able to capture that vote now, because Remain voters are going to Alliance and the Greens and everybody else. So it's going to be for whoever the new leader is to try and figure that out. And I think at some point, obviously, either we're going to be leaving on October 31st or we're leaving next year. That's really going to determine what happens going forward. So I think the Ulster Unionist Party are in a really difficult position. They really cannot. Their Brexit position is clear in some sense, but they really are kind of adrift from everything, because the DUP dominate that anti-backstop position. They don't really have the monopoly on that.
What hasn't helped as well for the UUP and the smaller parties in general has been the lack of Stormont. It hasn't given them that voice where they've been able to challenge the larger parties in terms of their stance on things. And as well, we've seen a cut in MLA salaries. There's been a lack of finance as well to try and finance any sort of clear opposition. And so therefore that's been a big problem for Robin Swan in trying to motivate his base to get around a clear narrative that would be distinguishable from the DUP.
Who replaces Robin Swan now? There's going to be this leadership contest that's going to go on until February. Obviously, there will probably be a debate now within the party about the future. Who do you think is the likely contenders to replace him?
Well, I suppose it depends on what way the party base wants to go, where they see the future of the UUP. I think that a clear front runner, I think, is Doug Beattie, if he is willing or wants to take on that position. I think that Doug would be seen as more of a more liberal voice within unionism, and so therefore would be distinguishable, I suppose, from hardline Brexit, hardline on social issues that the DUP is. And so therefore, if you were to take the UUP in that direction, that would be different from what the DUP is offering. I can't see any other particular standout voices at the moment, but we have a long debate to come, really, and there's plenty of people that could come forward in the next couple of months.
Okay, Brendan.
It's a fairly small pool to choose from if you assume it's going to come from the MLA grouping, and there are no MPs from whom to choose. So you're looking at, Doug Beattie is a clear front runner if he's on for it. Steve Aiken might emerge as a potential candidate. Some of the other MLAs in the UUP group are probably, I think, too early in their... Robbie Butler is an impressive media performer. He's a passionate guy. Probably too new on the scene. So I think that if I was making a bet, I don't usually make bets, but I would plump for Doug Beattie.
Doug Beattie. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Doug and Steve Aiken maybe are the front runners at the moment, but I think who would want that job, who really wants to step into that role? It's such a difficult position. I think Doug is an interesting candidate. Yes, he is very much seen as a very liberal unionist, but look, we've done this before. Henry Ulster Unionist has been slightly liberal, or what we consider to be liberal for the Ulster Unionist Party, is often at odds with the party itself and maybe sometimes with voters. So it's hard to see how they're going to get somebody that's going to be able to cover all those bases. And I think at the moment it's anybody's guess, really.
And the party membership choose the leader, and the party membership is mostly out west
Yeah.
and in Fermanagh and in places like that. So it'd be interesting to see what way they go. And you're right, Basil McRae, John McAllister before that.
We've done this.
Another issue when we're talking about local politics that has been coming up the past few weeks with an election has been the talk of potential pacts. A pro-Remain alliance, the Green Party leader Claire Bailey sent out a statement that she would like to meet with the leaders of Sinn Féin, the SDLP, an alliance to meet. Now, Alliance have pretty much rejected that, but in seats like South Belfast and North Belfast, this could be critical in terms of getting those seats. Brendan, what do you think about the politics of a pro-Remain?
I think that in the past, pacts, I think people need to even move away from that word, but it hasn't worked apart from those occasions where it always has been a feature between UUP and DUP, where they have often stood aside for one another if there's a question mark over a seat going to a nationalist. It just hasn't worked elsewhere. It hasn't worked on the other side of the house, on a nationalist side. But this is the election where genuinely moving away from nationalist versus unionist and looking upon it as Remain versus Brexit, it can make a difference. If there was agreement, probably unlikely to happen, but if there was agreement, Belfast, a Remain city, through and through a Remain city, feasibly could oust 3 DUP MPs, certainly could oust 2 DUP MPs, and I think 1 DUP MP is absolutely under pressure if there was a pro-Remain agreed candidate in South Belfast. But North Belfast is on the agenda as well. It would certainly liven up politics in Belfast. I think the odds on are probably on for a hung parliament again, or a very close outcome of a UK-wide election. Therefore, the Belfast and Northern Ireland MP outcomes are going to be very, very important again. Turnout will be high, I think. If it was to happen, if the Greens, SDLP, Sinn Féin alliance agreed on pro-Remain candidates in the 3 sitting Belfast seats and North Down as well, it could really shake things up and really do damage to the DUP. Will it happen? There may be some unilateral moves by individual parties as opposed to an overall agreement, but even that's worth watching.
Yeah. Sarah, what do you think about?
Yeah, I think a Remain pact would certainly be very, very threatening to the DUP, but I don't think it's going to work. I think as somebody said to me during the week, it's usually the people that are proposing the pact usually want everybody else to step aside for them. And the problem you've got is that, Alliance have come on the back of a very successful local European elections. They actually think they can make gains on this, so they don't really want to have to step aside. They've got a long history of being against pacts. Places like North Belfast, obviously, I think if Sinn Féin were to win that seat, that would send a very strong message, a very strong Remain message, maybe other different types of messages in that. But you will get some people that don't want to vote for an abstentionist candidate. They want to have a voice in Westminster, which is maybe where Claire Hanna might have the advantage in South Belfast. But again, it really depends on that Remain vote, how that goes. And I think the problem is really always is that the Remain parties, while they're all very anti-Brexit, they are split on really everything else, and they can't really seem to get a coherent message together. But it remains to be seen whether anything will happen. Claire Bailey says that she's willing to do something, but it is very difficult for a political party to say, well, we're going to step aside, and especially in the back of those European elections for Alliance, they're not going to be willing to do that.
Brendan?
We seem to be still some way off from an election actually being called, but I think at this stage I can't see that there will be any formal pacts announced, and I also can't see any formal pacts actually delivering the results that those pacts intend to do. If we look at North Belfast, for example, we have it's going to be a fight between Nigel Dodds of the DUP and John Finucane for Sinn Féin. John Finucane obviously put up a very strong challenge to Nigel Dodds in 2017, but going into this election, I think there has been a bit of a loss of momentum for him. Obviously, he has been elected in this year in May as a councillor, but in his ward of Castle, he was trying to bring in a running mate of Mary Ellen Campbell. Sinn Féin were trying to bring in 2 in that ward, but unfortunately Mary Ellen lost her seat. She was the former Deputy Lord Mayor, lost her seat, and actually I suppose a lot of people were expecting that John Finucane would have topped the poll in that area, but it was in fact Nuala McAllister of Alliance, off the back of the Alliance surge, who topped the poll in that area, and so I suppose took a bit of a shine off John Finucane getting a seat in the council election. So I suppose going and looking at specifically at North Belfast, if you were to consider whether there's going to be a Remain pact in that area, I think a lot of the other parties would. It would be surprising if they backed a candidate who isn't going to take their seat at Westminster, particularly the SDLP, who since losing their MPs has been, over the past couple of years, criticising the lack of having pro-Remain Northern Ireland MPs sitting in Westminster, taking it to the DUP and presenting the Remain voice of Northern Ireland within Westminster. So the idea that even if they unilaterally were standing aside in North Belfast, I think that would be a hard sell, and they would come under a lot of scrutiny from the press if they were to do that in this upcoming election.
Okay, so is there anything to be said then in terms of, so obviously Alliance have said they won't do it, but the Greens, and is there anything for, as you were saying, not a pact, but maybe just someone just does not run? I mean, the Alliance Party did this before in 2001 in North Down to get Sylvia Harman elected, and they did it with Joe Hendren in West Belfast as well. So is there anything for that to be done? Well,
I think Joe's election in 1992, I don't think Alliance standing on one side had much of an impact in West Belfast. It's a constituency where it still wouldn't have any impact at the moment, despite the Alliance surge that we hear about. There's a difference. I think the SDLP rightly say that your point, Brendan, that the pro-Remain voice has been missing in the House of Commons. But if the Remain Alliance or Remain agreement came about and you had SDLP with a clear run in South Belfast, Alliance with a clear run in East Belfast, and Sinn Féin with a clear run in North Belfast, and say those 3 seats were won, that's a turnaround of 5, because you're removing 3 pro-Brexit or anti-Remain MPs, and you're placing them with 2 sitting pro-Remain MPs. So that's a turnaround of 5. So knocking out Nigel Dodds and replacing with an abstention is far from ideal, but you're still reducing the Brexit majority by 1. It's another way of looking at that, and people might begin to think about whether or not that's worthwhile doing in North Belfast. Clearly Colin Eastwood will be saying to people in Derry, we need a voice in Westminster, which sort of negates that argument to some extent. We haven't heard that much talk about it publicly since there was the initial online chat about it all after Claire Bailey made her call for meetings. I mean, have meetings taken place? Have they had any outcome? Are they taking place within individual constituencies, within senior members of individual parties? We just don't know the answer to those questions. And yeah, the election talk died down because obviously October the 12th, I think, was the date people talked about. That's gone now, but I still think we're looking at an election before the end of this calendar year, either November or December. So all of these issues will be back on the table very soon.
Okay. Sarah, what do you think about the parties just unilaterally standing aside? So if Claire Bailey did not run in, just unilaterally decided not to do that, or say the SDLP in North Belfast?
Certainly they could do that, and you've given examples where that has been done quite successfully. I just think it just really just comes down to, if the parties do that in seats where they think they could win, and they will be judged for handing another party a seat. There's just not much unity between all these parties, and all of them want to have their moment in the spotlight. All of them want to be the voice for Remain in Northern Ireland, even though collectively obviously they've done a good job of working together in some things, but it remains to be seen whether that's going to be done yet, or whether, as Brendan says, whether people are talking about doing that. It's hard to know.
Say if Sinn Féin stood aside in South Belfast and SDLP stood aside in North Belfast, I don't see how that would benefit either of those intended pacts to try and get a pro-Remain candidate. You would see, I would think, in North Belfast, a hardening of the Unionist position. It would allow Nigel Dodds to say, and his supporters to say, you need to support the Union, you need to come out and vote for us. And in South Belfast, I think if the SDLP felt that was going to deliver Claire Hanna as the candidate, I think you'd find that either a lot of Sinn Féin voters would either stay at home or vote for Alliance. So it wouldn't deliver the result that they would want as well in that area. So I don't see how unilateral pacts would work there. I suppose just a note on the Unionist side of looking at pacts. Robin Swan, before he announced that he was standing down, did say that at this stage there is the intention of running 18 UUP candidates, and if that is the case, that's going ahead, then it doesn't seem to be any call for pacts among the Unionist side. I don't see how the UUP would allow any of its candidates or any candidates for the constituencies to stand aside, because I don't see how that would benefit them at this stage. Going into this sort of election, it's going to be a Remain versus Leave election. They don't have any MPs to lose, and really what would benefit the UUP at this stage is seeing the DUP take a hit, so therefore they can go back to their supporters and say the DUP has failed to deliver on Brexit, it has failed to deliver the Leave message and get a Brexit deal over the line. So therefore the idea of doing a deal with the DUP in order to allow DUP people to get seats doesn't seem to be productive, in my view, for the UUP. It's
noteworthy that the Alliance Party, who seem most steadfastly opposed to any kind of agreement, but yet the Lib Dems, their sister party and their parliamentary colleagues, did work together. I think it was a Welsh constituency, was the most recent by-election across the water, and successfully delivered a pro-Remain MP. And this should be seen as the one election where if there was a pact or agreement, or choose whatever word you want, it's not an Axis Unionist. It genuinely would be about Remain versus Leave, or no deal versus a better deal or a backstop deal. So if it was ever going to happen in constituencies in Northern Ireland, it's this election.
I definitely think it's the one election where it could be Remain versus Leave, but I think it's going to be Remain voting Unionists that are going to be the worst off in all of this, because yes, Leave Remain within unionism, but then there's the anti-backstop element of it, and obviously some unionists are very much in favour of that backstop. Some of them aren't, quite a majority of them aren't, and you could see the Ulster Unionist Party and the DUP, if they were to come to an agreement, maybe saying, look, we'll maybe help each other try and get some in Parliament. But I mean, at the end of the day, what happens is going to depend on who wins in Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem. Who's going to win the election? They may not be able to influence this at all, but you could possibly see that. But I think it's Remain voting Unionists that are going to be stuck here, because they're going to have to say, well, am I voting how am I going to vote in this election? Am I voting for the backstop? Am I voting not for a backstop? And that's where it's going to get interesting.
I'd be gobsmacked if the Ulster Unionists run 18 candidates if they stand against Nigel Dodds or in Fermanagh South Tyrone. Okay, so obviously we're talking about party positions. We are just currently at the end of party conference season, and there've been a few developments. So obviously the Lib Dems were the first to kick off, and they really have taken this go hard or go home approach. That they've said their policy now is to, if a Lib Dem majority government, don't laugh at that, comes to power, they will just use a parliamentary vote to cancel Brexit. No second referendum, nothing else. Brendan, that was a very audacious move by Joe
It was
Swinson.
an audacious move. Some people could describe it as an extreme move, but you know what? I mean, they're not going to get a parliamentary majority. But when you go before the people, you do produce a manifesto. It does include policies and positions you will take in government. I think it's quite legitimate to say, you know what, people of the United Kingdom, if you vote us into power, here's what we're going to do. Things have moved on since June 2016. I think it's absolutely politically legitimate for the Lib Dems and for all parties to recognise that, to take that into account, and to take a position into a forthcoming general election. At least they are clear cut. It's more than we can say for some of the other parties, and we'll talk about them as well. You know, we do not know where Jeremy Corbyn stands. Well, we probably do actually know where he stands when it comes to Brexit versus Remain, but he's clearly not going to take a position into any debate, into a general election, even into a second referendum, a confirmatory referendum if we were to reach that stage. I think that's totally bizarre. I think it's unsustainable, and I think it's a lack of political leadership.
Yeah, okay. Sarah, what do you
think?
think?
What you're saying here is a very clear positions from the Tories and the Lib Dems, where the Lib Dems are like, well, we're going to revoke it, we're going to Remain. The Tories are basically, we are getting out hell or high water. But the Labour position is interesting because they seem to be going for, which is interesting for Labour, which often talks about centrists, but they seem to be trying to occupy a very centre position here, which is basically, and I don't think wrongly, I think they know that there's probably a lot of people in this country who are happy to compromise, and I think they might be trying to go for that in a very strange way. So their position is basically they're going to try, if they get elected, they will negotiate a deal and then put their deal to the people in a referendum against Remain. I think in the hope of saying, well, if you want Brexit, it's our deal, but if you're willing to compromise in a soft Brexit, it's our deal. And I think that's where they're kind of going. But the danger is if Jeremy Corbyn really isn't going to have a position on this, and if it's a very hard leave Remain election. I mean, I get where you can kind of almost see the logic of him saying, well, I'm just going to do what people tell me to do. But if people are really voting strongly on that issue, is that going to work for him? We don't know.
I mean, and Brendan, at the Labour conference, you had the bizarre scene of the teller of the vote calling one outcome, and then someone said, oh no, she told me a different outcome. So what do you think of where Labour is and where the Lib Dems are at the minute?
I suppose there was so much confusion around the Labour conference and among the members as to what way they were going to go, and I suppose luckily for them there was the court judgment, the Supreme Court judgment, that sort of overshadowed everything that was, all the chaos that was going on at their party conference. I think Labour has been pushed into this compromise position by the Lib Dems, because the Lib Dems came out with their party conference first, and they have now moved from being a people's vote second referendum party to now going to this sort of more hard Remain position of, if we are in a majority government, which doesn't seem very likely, then we will deliver on Remain, we will revoke Article 50. And I think that has therefore pushed the Labour Party into sort of a more compromise position. And it's odd to be describing a second referendum as a compromise position, because a year ago, even like earlier this year, the idea of describing a people's vote as being some sort of middle ground, and this is a rational approach that can bring the country together, that would be seen as surprising. It was seen as a radical move by many parties to even support a second referendum or a people's vote. But now Labour is occupying that space. It remains to be seen, I suppose, whether that will pay off in an election, especially when you have the hardline Brexiteer positions of Conservatives, which under their party conference, it seems that their position is, or their slogan is, get Brexit done. So they are positioning themselves as, we're the only party, the only credible party that can deliver Brexit, versus you have the hard Remain position of the Lib Dems. So are Labour going to get lost in the middle of all that?
Okay, and Brendan, what do you think about in terms of, obviously you have the Conservative Party meeting, and of course the Conservatives seem to be doubling down on just the more strident rhetoric, no matter, the House of Commons passes a law against the 31st, and they're still, Sajid David, the Chancellor, again saying, no, October 31st, we're out, despite a law being passed against that.
Yeah, and I think the use of language a couple of weeks ago, when the first day of the Commons was called back after the Supreme Court decision, I think the choice of language that day, not just by Boris Johnson, but by all of the front bench, I think it was sustained, it was deliberate, it was designed to provoke this extreme reaction, so that the people out there in the street, the hard Brexiteers, can say, our guys are going to do it, they're going to do it no matter what. But, it's hard to see. The wheels appear to be falling off this Johnson government, and he's only been in place for a little over 2 months, and frankly, It's been 2 months not marked with any degree of credibility or political maturity, trying to be kind here. It seems as if what hell or high water, even if I'll break the law, I mean, what does that mean? What does that say about the state of parliamentary democracy, the role of the judiciary, the role of parliamentary sovereignty? I think it's a crazy situation that we're in right now. Boris Johnson appears to be trying to go over the heads of everybody and aiming at a very specific sector of people who just want Brexit and don't care what that means. It's a very dangerous road to go down. And if he thinks this is the key to him getting a long-term stay in number 10 Downing Street, he's going to damage the institution so much in getting to that position. Is it really going to be worthwhile? I don't think it is.
Yeah. Sarah, what do you think of some of the language? And again, the government just seem to be consistently doubling down on this.
I think Boris Johnson, I think he is going to try and be the hero here. This is what he's trying to go for. He's going to deliver Brexit and he's going to do anything to stop it. And I think, his behaviour in the Commons has been disgraceful. I mean, the way he spoke after that MP talked about the murder of Joe Cox was outrageous. It was absolutely outrageous. I think he probably knows himself, and it's not going to endear him or any of the other MPs across the aisle to him. But they are doubling down on this. They are basically saying that they're getting us out on 31st of October. How they're going to do it, I don't know. Given that he's legally required to go and ask for this extension. Obviously, the EU, we don't know if they're going to say yes yet. Likely they are, but the rhetoric of the government is they are very much just playing to people in the street, because not in Northern Ireland but in England, people are angry about Brexit. I think the people are very genuinely furious that this has not happened yet, and I think he is trying to play into that and ride it up. But interesting though, as you were saying earlier, Brendan, they're talking here about a hung parliament, which is going to which I think shows the true nature of the country, which is that it is not straightforward out there. But it is very worrying that the rhetoric is ratcheting up. And that he is basically setting the bar very low, I think. But I would expect nothing less from Boris Johnson personally.
How they're going to deliver this hell or high water, getting out by the 31st, whilst adhering to the law. I mean, Sajid Javid, last week when he was doing the rounds of media interviews, he was a bit like Josh in the West Wing. He has a secret plan that he's not going to tell anyone about. So it's going to be interesting to see what this loophole is that they think they have found. And there are smart heads on the other side of the table who are trying to preempt those moves and try and combat those moves as well. Yeah,
it's interesting when you look at the polls. I mean, the Conservatives are ahead, but they're only on about 30 to 32% of the vote, and Labour are back on the low 20s. So, I mean, interesting that the language isn't hurting Boris Johnson, but equally the Tory vote would be about nearly 10 points off what Theresa May got in 2017.
Mm-hmm. I suppose after the Supreme Court judgment, after such a blow to the government, you would have expected that Boris Johnson would have come back to a resumed Parliament with more conciliatory language. After all, he is a Prime Minister who claims that he wants to try and get a deal and leave the EU with a deal. And you would have expected him, therefore, to sort of maybe appease the Parliament and admit some sort of wrongdoing and that was the wrong decision. No, instead we got the opposite. They were doubling down. We saw a much more inflamed language, and I think that has not got him any sort of favours and is not going to endear people to him. So the idea that we're going to have a deal at this stage seems unlikely. In terms of their position of get Brexit done, I think that this is what they're banking on. They feel that people are so fed up with talking about Brexit for the past couple of years that we are the party that will deliver Brexit, and so therefore that's the only way that we will stop talking about this is if you vote for the Conservatives. But of course that three-word slogan is complete nonsense, because if there is a deal, that just means that the UK is going to go into a transition period and we will be discussing what the future trading relationship is with the EU. And as Leo Varadkar said whenever Boris Johnson came to meet him in Dublin, if there is no deal, it will simply be a case that the UK at some point will have to come back to the EU as one of its biggest trading blocs and come up with a deal, and the EU will be saying we want these issues sorted first before we discuss a trading agreement, and they will be EU citizens' rights, divorce bill and the Irish border, and so therefore we'll be back to square one. So the idea of get Brexit done, clean break Brexit is total nonsense.
Okay, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for going through the issues. I want to thank my guests, Brendan Mulgrew, Sarah Creighton and Brendan Hughes. And keep up to date with the latest developments on sluggerotool.com. We'll be back next month. Thank you for watching.